Theoretical and Feminist Perspectives. As we continue our exploration of violence, religion, and rape, it's time to step back and ask a broader question. What theoretical lenses help us make sense of these realities? So far, we've looked at definitions, personal consequences, and the role of social norms. But behind all of these are deeper systems of thought, cultural patterns, theological traditions, psychological mechanisms that normalize or challenge violence. Today, we'll examine two sets of perspectives: feminist theology and psychological theories of obedience and moral disengagement. Feminist theology, religion as a site of oppression and liberation. Let's begin with feminist theology. For centuries, religion has been criticized for perpetuating patriarchal structures. Teachings about women's purity, submission, and silence have often been used to justify control over female bodies and sexuality. Feminist theologians argue that these patterns are not accidental. They are embedded in how religious texts have been interpreted, how rituals have been shaped, and how power has been distributed. Grace Jantzen, in her work Foundations of Violence, 2004, makes a striking argument. She claims that Western culture has a necrophilic fixation, a preoccupation with death, violence, and domination. She draws on Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus, showing how cultural norms become internalized as common sense. According to Jantzen, violence is normalized through symbolic systems, through the very language and metaphors of Western religion and culture. Think about it. Our scriptures, our literature, our everyday speech are filled with metaphors of war, conquest, and punishment. This language doesn't just describe violence, it perpetuates it. Jantzen points out that women in particular are systematically silenced in these traditions. Violence, she argues, is not an inevitable part of human nature. It is disproportionately enacted by men and reinforced by male-dominated cultures. The idea that violence is just natural is itself a form of rationalization. Now, let's add another important voice. Elisabeth Schüssler, Fiorenza. In her book In Memory of Her, 1983, Fiorenza reconstructs early Christian history from a feminist perspective. She reminds us that women were not merely passive figures. They were disciples, leaders, patrons, and witnesses, including Mary Magdalene, the first to witness the resurrection. Yet over time, their roles were erased or minimized by patriarchal structures. Fiorenza argues that as long as women's voices are excluded, the Bible will continue to function as an oppressive text. But if we recover women's stories, we can see the gospel itself as liberating. The challenge, she says, is to distinguish between the patriarchal cultural layers and the core message of Christ. Finally, let's not forget Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the early feminist interpreters of the Bible. In the late 19th century, she produced the Woman's Bible, arguing that reforming society required reforming biblical interpretation itself. Stanton insisted that women had to claim the right to read scripture critically, to challenge oppressive interpretations, and to affirm their dignity. Together, these feminist theologians show us two things. Religion has indeed been a site of oppression, reinforcing violence against women, but religion can also be reinterpreted, reclaimed as a source of justice, equality, and healing. This is why feminist theology matters for our topic. It teaches us to look critically at religious narratives, to ask who benefits from this interpretation, and whose voices are being silenced. Psychological perspectives. Obedience and moral disengagement. Now, let's turn to psychology. One of the most famous psychological studies of the 20th century was Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s. Many of you may be familiar with the setup. Participants were instructed to deliver electric shocks to another person, escalating in intensity whenever the person answered incorrectly. In reality, no shocks were given, but the participants believed they were inflicting real pain. What Milgram found was unsettling. A majority of participants obeyed authority figures, even when it meant harming another human being. This has often been described as blind obedience. But later scholars, such as Russell and Gregory, 2010, argue that it's more complex. People weren't simply robots following orders. They were negotiating a sense of duty, responsibility, and hierarchy. In other words, institutions and authority figures create environments where individuals feel compelled to obey, even when it violates their conscience. Why does this matter for us? Because sexual violence, domestic violence, and institutional abuse often occur within hierarchies of authority: families, schools, military units, religious communities. Understanding obedience helps us see why people comply with harmful systems and why bystanders remain silent. Building on this, Albert Bandura developed the concept of moral disengagement. This is the process by which people justify or excuse harmful behavior so that they can act without guilt. Examples include minimizing responsibility, I was just following orders, distorting consequences. It wasn't really that bad. Blaming the victim, she asked for it. Dehumanization, viewing victims as less than fully human. Research confirms that moral disengagement is strongly linked to aggression. Genie et al., 2014, found this across nearly 18,000 participants, especially among adolescents. More recent studies, Nocera et al., 2022, Agudelo Rico et al., 2024, show that dehumanization is one of the strongest predictors, not just of bullying, but of systemic violence and even law-breaking behavior. Think about this. If someone sees their victim as less than human, violence becomes easier to justify. This is true whether we're talking about schoolyard bullying, intimate partner violence, or genocide. Bringing it together. So, what do these perspectives teach us? Feminist theology reminds us that violence is not just an individual act. It is woven into cultural and religious narratives. To resist violence, we must reinterpret and reclaim those narratives in ways that affirm dignity and equality. Psychology reminds us that violence is not just about bad people making bad choices. It is often about ordinary people caught in systems of authority and justification. Obedience and moral disengagement show us how good people can commit harmful acts or remain silent in the face of them. Together, these perspectives urge us to see violence not as random or inevitable, but as socially constructed and sustained. That means it can also be dismantled. As we move forward, we'll turn to the historical and scriptural perspectives, how Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism each grapple with sexual violence in their sacred texts and traditions. These will show us both the depth of the problem and the seeds of possible solutions.